Hey, hello, I'm Bettis Baumstrasser, an arborist from the southern part of Germany, an area called the Schwäbische Alb. Very lovely area situated somewhere in between Stuttgart and the Lake Constance. Today I wanted to tell you a story of a well-known harness. And no worries, I tried to keep it short since English is not my mother language. When I started climbing about 40 years ago, we used rock climbing harnesses. A few years later then, we did the first cone picking campaigns with my friend Uli Distel. And that's when we realized rock climbing harnesses are not good for long days in the trees. So we started thinking about new features of improvement to create a better harness. So you could basically say the first ideas came from campfire ideas in the forest, picking cones. At that time we were using harnesses from Troll or Petzl and later on the Butterfly from Comet. All good harnesses, but they all had missing features, especially for long days in the trees picking cones. Most of the harnesses at that time had a fixed central attachment point. If so, they had a white webbing bridge where you couldn't attach a carabiner to. They had stiff back pads and no free-floating front Ds. So these were basically the main points I started to work on. In that time I started gathering different material. For example, I carried out hardware from old harnesses, also bought hardware at sailing stores, bought webbing and padding materials, and started to work on the first prototypes. At one point I was visiting Uli Distel at his place and found an interesting material that was later on used as base material for the harness. He was using it as adjustment straps for his spikes that he was producing at that point in time. Around 2000 I was living in a truck. In that time I bought a sewing machine, placed it up there in the barn and started to experiment. My main goals were spreading the load more evenly, free-floating forward Ds, and a mobile anchor point with the possibility of direct carabiner attachments. The stitches I was doing, I used an early GRCS Harkin winch to test, just to make sure they were strong enough. After a few months, I finally had the first harness I could climb with. But soon I realized that from a campfire idea to a finished product, it's a long path. A few years and many samples later, I finally had a harness I was happy with. Around that time I met Chris and Mark. I think it was at the ETCC in Westernbird, 2003, when we then had the first long evenings talking about equipment, especially harness and hitch climber system. Later on in the year in Germany then I met at Uli Pfeffer's place, I met Chris and showed him the harness I was working on. In spring 2004, we were all working together at Mark's place in Basel. In the evenings, messing around in Mark's kitchen with climbing equipment, we decided that it was necessary to meet more often. And we tried to make a little plan of how to proceed. At some point, it became clear that new hardware was necessary. First, I started to work on samples together with a friend of mine. Later on, through contacts from Chris, we started to work with DMM on specific hardware, side D assemblies, forward Ds and anchorings. The development was done in our spare time. The financing of the development was done out of our own pocket. Next challenge was to find a harness manufacturer. We went to different companies, none of them really showed interest. We almost reached the end of the line. Just by chance, Chris called FSE on another subject and ended up in the Teufelberger headquarters talking to Anna Aschauer. As a result of that, we had a meeting scheduled with Markus Langanger a few weeks later in Basel, talking about the harness. Somehow we must have made an impact, since the three of us soon after went to the Teufelberger headquarters in Wels to meet with Markus and development engineers to think about how to move the project forward. We had to generate 500 pre-orders before the production from Teufelberger was confirmed. We certified the harness ourselves via SGS in the UK. Finally, at the ITCC 2006 in Minneapolis, we had the first public showing, together with a hitch climber system, in the competition and also a demonstration on the Cheryl booth. Gear check, sure enough, at the ITCC was an event. We had a folder full of test results to convince the committee, it was Tim Bushnell at that point in time, I think, that we could use the harness and the hitch climber system in the competition. Turned out that it was a successful competition, using both the harness and the hitch climber system. At that time, all three of us were still working as full-time climbing arborists. Production of the TreeMOTION started in 2006. Since that time, Treemagineers have been continually thinking about harness evolution.